Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss of the Center for American Progress, and with me today, for the first time, is Khaled Elgindy, a fellow at the Brookings Institution. Welcome, Khaled.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing this.
Sure.
Why don't you just give us a little bit of background on yourself, and then we can go into today's conversation.
Sure. Before I came to Brookings about 2.5 years ago, I was an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah, where I spent about 5.5 years there working for the negotiation support unit, working on permanent status, preparing for permanent status negotiations with Israel. And I was in charge of the settlements file, which became active actually during the Annapolis talks in late 2007 and then throughout 2008 when we were negotiating or at least talking to our Israeli counterparts on the issue of territory and borders.
So that's kind of timely now, given over the latest controversy over E1.
Right.
I know we had some other things we want to cover with regard to the UN bid and the Gaza ceasefire, but talk a bit about, if you could, about why E1 is so significant.
Yeah, E1 is technically stands for East 1, I think. It is to the east of East Jerusalem, sort of situated between the settlement, the very large settlement of Ma'ale Adumim and Palestinian East Jerusalem. And it is seen as a very strategic point because it overlooks both Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley. So it is kind of the nexus between the two, and whoever controls it essentially controls movement between the north-south of the West Bank and, of course, access to Jordan through the Jordan Valley. So it is seen as essential to any future Palestinian state because it would, on the one hand, complete the circle of settlements around East Jerusalem, therefore kind of cutting it off from the rest of the West Bank. And at the same time, it would split the northern West Bank from the southern West Bank. So it is an extremely, extremely strategic area, which is precisely why Israel has been trying to build there and has had plans to build there for a long time. And successive American administrations have intervened to get commitments from Israel to not build there. And even though we haven't seen any real meaningful settlement freeze ever really, the one thing that the U.S. has insisted on is not building in E1. So even the United States understands how crucial it is to a Palestinian state.
So what's your take? I mean, what is going on here? I mean, I think on the surface, it's a reaction from the Israelis to the UN vote last week. What else do you sense is going on here?
Well, it is a reaction. I think on the surface, like you said, it's a reaction. But I think there's more to it than that. I think there is, it's not just the right wing that supports building an E1 in Israel. This Ehud Barak also is a fan of E1, and in the past, it was Yitzhak Rabin who wanted to build an E1, and Israelis have only been prevented from doing so by American intervention. I think this is just part of an ongoing effort to build facts on the ground at an accelerated pace. The UN bid gives them a good pretext to do that because everyone was expecting there have to be some punishment. The odd thing about it, though, is that if you're going to punish the Palestinians, and I put that in quotation marks, you would think that you would find a way to punish them that wasn't also punishing yourself, because presumably Israel accepts a two-state solution, and
presumably, yes,
right, and so this government, Netanyahu's government, pays lip service to a two-state solution. But I think one thing that this latest development tells us is their concept of a two-state solution, their understanding of a Palestinian state, is not the same as certainly the Palestinian understanding, but may not actually resemble an actual state in terms of sovereignty and contiguity and so on. So they may have every intention of giving Palestinians something that they would call a state, but
right.
I don't think it really lines up with how most people view a state.
Right. No, I think that's clear. I mean, we often hear the references. Yeah, they can have a song and a flag,
Right.
and then that's about it. We'll call it a state. But in terms of punishing the Palestinians, it seems like how about you don't end the 45-year occupation? That seems like a pretty punishment in itself. But going back to the UN bid, what is your okay? So just the atmospherics around it. Does it matter? Does it change much? If so, what does it change?
Well, obviously, it doesn't change much on the ground. It changes a lot diplomatically and possibly legally. Palestinians would have access to other UN bodies like the International Criminal Court. They could bring suits against Israel. That is that gives them, theoretically anyway, some leverage at the diplomatic level. And I think that's really where the focus was as far as Mahmoud Abbas's initiative. I think it was really it wasn't designed to skirt negotiations or to avoid them, but to enhance his negotiating position in what he sees as inevitable negotiations. So, for Mahmoud Abbas, negotiations are the first and last choice. But he cannot afford to go back to the table the way the United States and the Quartet keep calling, kind of formulaically, just bring the parties back to the negotiating table. Because those negotiations are bound to fail. He does not have the room to maneuver. Some would question whether he even has a mandate to negotiate issues like refugees and even Gaza, issues related to Gaza, since he doesn't control it. So he
right. Let's just stop there for a sec. Let's back up and spin that out a bit more. But why? Because yes, he has. A lot of people say, why won't he negotiate? Why, if Netanyahu keeps saying, I'm ready to talk, why doesn't he just call Netanyahu's bluff, since it's abundantly clear that Netanyahu is not serious about two states? Why talk about why he doesn't have the room to do that.
Well, the reason he does, because he's done it in the past. He's resisted, if you remember, back to the very beginning of the Obama administration, when they were trying to get that meeting at the UN General Assembly a few months into the administration. And Abbas was resisting. All they essentially wanted was a photo op of him and Netanyahu standing there, and presumably it would hint towards some process. And he refused, and there was massive arm twisting going on just for that tiny little initiative of a photo op in New York. And, each time he goes to the negotiating table, or appears to be going to the negotiating table, he gets weaker because he's participating in a process that the vast majority of Palestinians consider to be a sham. They consider it to be cover for ongoing settlement activity. They consider it to be a cover for a blockade on Gaza, for incursions in the West Bank. They see the process as being a way to perpetuate this occupation, and diplomatic activity relieves pressure from Israel and increases pressure on the Palestinians. On the one hand, he has to deliver something; he can't just go to be part of a theatrical process. So, and then each time there's a failure in these talks, there's a cost. There's a political cost to all parties, but especially to the weakest party, and that's the Palestinians. So there are real concrete reasons why he cannot go back to the negotiating table as much as he wants to.
So it seems, having heard this this is a justification that a number of Palestinian officials have given. One of the goals of the UN bid, in addition to the upgraded status, was a frame of reference for eventual negotiations.
Right.
The 67 lines, not as the ultimate border, but as a starting point for negotiations. And I think this is very consistent with what President Obama tried to do in his May 2011 speech. in talking about the 67 borders with land swaps, which of course, obviously, created a huge firestorm in the U.S.,
Right.
most of it in bad faith, I think. But also, I mean, if you go back and look at the Palestine papers, the notes from the negotiation support unit, and given the fact that you work for the negotiation support unit, you may or may not want to comment on it, but it seems to me when I read those papers, what I was struck by were the Palestinians trying to establish precisely that, trying to get the Israelis to be more forthcoming in terms of, okay, what are we all starting with? Where are our starting points?
Right.
And the Israelis kind of kicking that can down the road, and you'll understand what sort of frame up that is if the Israelis are in the constant process of creating new facts on the ground, and they are effectively creating new starting points all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And we encountered that firsthand in our technical committee talks with the Israeli side during the year of the Annapolis talks. We spent we met with our Israeli counterparts probably 10 times, and we spent at least the first 5 or 6 meetings trying to establish the 1967 line as the basis, which had been the basis of every past negotiation and every attempt at resolving the conflict. Obviously the whole Land for Peace formula that enshrined in Resolution 242, and all of these are basic fundamentals of the peace process. And we found that there was so much resistance. The Israeli line was, look, a lot's happened in 45 years, or at that point it was less than 45 years, but a lot's happened over 4 decades, and the starting point is facts on the ground. And we resisted that. Now that was at one level of the talks. There were different levels going on, and what we later found out is that the level that involved the one-on-one between Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert was proceeding at a very different pace and in a different and very different in terms of the content of those talks. So Olmert did accept the idea of 1967 as the basis, but not publicly. Until later, I believe, until he was out of office, and then his plan became public, and he wrote a book and all that.
Which is helpful to no one.
Right. But everybody on Earth understands that 1967 line is the basis, and I agree with you. The reaction to Obama's statement in May of 2011, I guess, was hugely exaggerated and I would say manufactured, because at no point did people say that 1967 was the end point, although I think the vast majority of Palestinians would certainly want that, but that it was a starting point based on one-to-one swaps. And the swaps would have to be minimal and not affect contiguity and all of that. But the principle was 1967, and that's I think that's really one of the key issues for what compelled Abbas to go to the UN is to get language reaffirming 1967 in that resolution. So the Palestinian state is not just recognized by the UN, but it's also recognized within these borders. And I think that was, frankly, something that if and when negotiations on a two-state solution ever happen, people will probably thank Mahmoud Abbas for doing that. I'm not necessarily a fan of his leadership, but I think he has done more to advance the two-state solution with one visit to the UN than all the other actors, from the Quartet to certainly Israel, the United States, and everyone combined. And for him to be the one who's punished for doing that, I think says a lot about everybody else's commitment to a two-state solution.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I remarked the other day, it's like, imagine, if you were Rip Van Winkle, you fell asleep 20 years ago and woke up to see the head of the PLO going to the UN to ask for a resolution recognizing two states on the 67 lines, and it was opposed by the U.S. and Israel.
Yeah.
You just be called. You think that was crazy, but yet here we are. And I think you've written about this. I mean, it really speaks to the sort of frame up that exists with regard to the quartet process, which you wrote a very, very good paper.
Thank you.
For Brookings, called, I think, the Quartet Postmortem.
Right.
So just describe what you talk about in that piece, your analysis there.
Well, the analysis was of the quartet as a body. The U.S., the EU, Russia, and the United Nations formed this entity, this contact group called the Quartet, whose task it was to mediate between the two sides and attempt to resolve the conflict. And so I took the study. I looked at the quartet as kind of an embodiment of the peace process as a whole. And so the critique of the quartet is more than just about the quartet, because it's not just about how those four actors interact with one another or what they tell the parties, but it's more about all of the baggage that has been attached to the peace process under the auspices of the quartet. And what you find is a deeply dysfunctional process. At almost every level. And in fact, the goals that it is achieving are not at all what they were when the group was first formed. In addition to the fact that realities on the ground have changed considerably between the two parties, in the region, of course, and within the parties themselves. So I would say my biggest critique of the quartet is that it continued to operate on assumptions that were no longer true, if ever they were, and to the extent that...
Just stop for a second and describe those assumptions.
Well, the assumption that you could negotiate with one part of the Palestinians, you could push Israel to negotiate with one set of Palestinians, while allowing it to impose a blockade and essentially make war on another set of Palestinians, and that this would somehow be conducive to peace. The assumption that we went into this process in Madrid, if you go back to the actual start of the bilateral talks between Israelis and Palestinians, where you had a situation, we had a unitary, coherent Palestinian leadership with all of its problems and flaws and dysfunctions and issues internally and externally, but it was one single address called the PLO. And fast forward to 2006 and 2007, and certainly today, it's no longer the case. The PLO no longer has a monopoly on the claim to legitimacy, to represent the Palestinians, at least not an undisputed claim. And to pretend that Hamas wasn't rising and that the PA wasn't declining, I think or that had no effect on this process, I think was a fundamental delusion that was built into how the quartet operated.
Talk a little bit. I'm sorry. I mean, I interrupted you. You were talking about some of the false assumptions. I mean, you were continuing to talk about the analysis of the paper. Go ahead and continue with the key points there.
I mean, the false assumptions, and then it was, the very goals of the quartet had been transformed from, it came about at a time of intense conflict between the two sides during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, when there was bloodshed on the ground. There was on both sides, frankly, there was a lot of killing going on, and there was a real crisis and a real desire by the region and the international community to try and bring an end to this process, to the bloodletting, and restart some kind of a diplomatic process. And instead of serving as a mediator between two parties, what the quartet became was more of a tool by which to micromanage one party, namely the Palestinians. So it became all about state building, and it became, the mission was downgraded from Arab-Israeli peace or even Israeli-Palestinian peace to kind of conflict management, but by only managing one side. And so, we had this whole debate for years about the roadmap. The roadmap being the seminal plan of the Quartet, supposedly representing the will of the international community. There are obligations on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side. And for the first several years of the roadmap's existence, we couldn't tell if we were in phase 1 or phase 0. Every American official we would ask is, has the clock started ticking yet on the roadmap? Some would say yes, some would say no. Well, when do we know? When does it start? And then there was also a debate about whether Israeli and Palestinian obligations were supposed to be in parallel or sequential. And that is, that Palestinians would have to meet their obligations first before Israel would be asked to meet its. That was the Israeli understanding, and to a large extent became the de facto American understanding. But even that pretext, I think, was exploded by Salam Fayyad's state-building plan, where he basically undertook to fulfill Palestinian obligations, regardless of what Israel was doing, if only to remove the pretext of we don't have a partner, we can't make progress, and so on. Now, that tactic didn't really work. I mean, it just sort of, I think, inoculated everyone to the need for a resolution. But
right. I mean, and also, if one of the conditions, as in the roadmap, is an end to anti-Israel incitement, then anytime some Palestinian official says something mean about Israel, the Israelis can always point to that and say, oh, they're not meeting their commitments.
Right. Or anytime that some operative or attack happens to get through, all of these can be pretexts. And there was a time when the PA didn't control the Palestinian street and couldn't do basic law and order, couldn't provide basic law and order for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza at the time. So it has increased its capacity considerably since then. But the proposition that progress will beget progress was just shown to be a lie. It just wasn't there. Palestinian progress did not induce Israel to adhere to its responsibilities, or nor did it get the international community to move the process forward or do anything. And so, one of the big problems with this approach was that it was all focused on the one side. If we can just reinvent the Palestinian leadership and institutions, then all will be well. But even when you do that, at great cost to Palestinian institutions and leadership, by the way, the only way Salam Fayyad could carry out this plan to build Palestinian institutions at some level was by Palestinians having to undergo a civil war. And so, what does institution building mean in the context of a dysfunctional and divided authority, where you have two ministries, two of every ministry, two prime ministers, one in Gaza, one in the West Bank, and virtually no coordination between them, where each side claims legitimacy, each side claims that it rightfully rules. How do you have, what does institution building mean when the most fundamental institution, a functioning elected parliament, doesn't exist? A large number of the members of parliament were jailed by Israel, but even on days when they could get a quorum, they can't get a quorum. Because of the division. So the parliament doesn't function. It's divided. Nobody knows who speaks for the Palestinians. So what does institution building mean? And I think that's also part of the critique of this approach, that if you want to create an ever-shrinking world and say, this is, Palestinians can become perfect actors in this ever-shrinking world, then it's just not meaningful. It would probably be more meaningful to have national unity and institutional coherence that was somewhat imperfect than to have a perfectly run entity running out of Area A in the West Bank, which, is not a viable anything. So, I just question the premises of this whole approach. And I think it serves to be, it's really, I would say, designed to be a distraction from the political process. I think a lot of the state building stuff was really a way to avoid dealing with the political and diplomatic realities.
Right. And I think you made this point as well. And when you look at the quartet in its totality, it seems to have functioned as basically a mechanism for, giving the U.S. and Israeli, concerns the veneer of international legitimacy. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think I would call it sham internationalism. It's unilateralism in the garb of multilateralism.
Right, which is which is why the claims of the inaccurate labeling of the UN bid as unilateralism is all the more preposterous.
Yeah.
But I think you've made some very good points about the way this process historically, and especially under the quartet, paid far too little attention or placed too little importance on Palestinian politics. Talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, I would even go further. I would say not only it does more than just pay too little attention. It doesn't pay any attention. It's not a factor in how Palestinians are dealt with. The fact that they were, the contrast is all the greater when you see the enormous deference and sensitivity to every, tweak in the Israeli coalition, the governing coalition.
Right.
One day Mofaz is in, the next day he's out. What's the future of Barak and that? And
well, right. Even more than that, you hear people attacking the call for a settlement freeze. Because the Israelis just don't support that. Well, it's settlements are against international law.
Right.
It's an interesting detail. It's practically in a practical matter. It's interesting and important to know what Israeli politicians can and can't do and how hard it is to do those things. But as a matter of international law, it matters very little.
Absolutely, and I would say, I think point blank, the only reason we do not have the Americans and international community insisting on a settlement freeze, the only reason is because of internal domestic Israeli politics and to some extent domestic politics of their own in the United States or in Europe. So there is no other reason. It's not as if there are security implications or that it would somehow, no one can make the case that there's no other reason to not have a freeze other than a sensitivity to Israeli domestic political needs. There is the exact opposite situation when it comes to Palestinian politics. Palestinians actually went through a civil war. And not only was that sort of directly or indirectly encouraged, really, by the United States, but there was no consideration given to the basic mathematical fact that Mahmoud Abbas came out of that situation when Hamas took the Gaza Strip much more weakened and with much less room to maneuver. And I find it interesting that after 6 years of the G.W. Bush administration, it was only in the weeks after Hamas took over the Gaza Strip that there suddenly was talk about the need for an international conference and to restart negotiations. It was only in that moment when the PA was on, could have collapsed, that they decided to rescue Mahmoud Abbas with some sort of a political process after letting him kind of dangle in the wind since he had been elected. So you know, all of the normal considerations that one thinks about in virtually any other context, any conflict at all in the world. One looks at not only the dynamic between the two conflicting parties, but also their own internal dynamics, and trying to devise a way forward. There was never any consideration for that. In fact, just the other day, I heard Hillary Clinton say that, you know, sort of reaffirm her belief that we can make progress if we can bring the parties back to the negotiating table, and that we ought to talk to the Palestinians, at least the ones in the West Bank. And again, I contest this notion that that you can have a negotiation with one part of a people and make war against the other part. It would be like, you know, Mahmoud Abbas could arrive at an agreement tomorrow with the Merits in Israel, but does that matter? Does that have any relevance?
Right.
And I'm not equating. I'm not saying that Mahmoud Abbas is totally irrelevant, but you know, when he represents a party that lost the last election, and that other party is now ruling 40% of his population, you know, he's not really in a position to claim a mandate, I would say.
Yeah. So what's the process by which a mandate can be had? I mean, what do we have to see? And is it, I mean, at this point, is it even conceivable that you could unite the Palestinian national movement, the Palestinian government?
Yeah, I think it's conceivable. I mean, look, there are, I'm running low on power here, but it's conceivable. There are real consensus building problems across the region. We're seeing it in Syria, we're seeing it in Egypt, and certainly it's there on the Palestinian scene. I think it is possible, but it's going to be difficult. At this point, though, I would say it is less difficult than trying to reach a conflict-ending agreement between Israelis and Palestinians.
So what would you like to see? So you think the focus here, I mean, in terms of U.S. policy, I mean, what's your advice here?
I mean, my advice is, you know, sort of counterintuitive, or at least counter to the trend. I would say, don't try to bring the parties back to the negotiating table, because it's not going to work. And if it works, an agreement on paper can't be implemented on the ground, because quite simply Mahmoud Abbas does not have the ability to do that. I would say let Palestinians fix their own house, and that means that the U.S., as bizarre as it is to have to say it, the U.S. is going to have to come to terms with a coherent Palestinian entity, because there is no option of doing away with Hamas. And if you insist on a zero-sum proposition, and you're not shoring up your guy, which is the case now, your guy's going to lose. So at this point, I would say the only way to save Mahmoud Abbas and save the idea of a two-state solution is to encourage the party, or at least allow Palestinians, Hamas and Fatah, to reconcile. And that's... I mean,
interestingly, Salam Fayyad, Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, who was in D.C. the other night for the premiere of this documentary called State 194 about his state-building efforts, made very, very positive remarks about the necessity of reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. All the more interesting given that Hamas reportedly placed a condition on the unity government that Salam Fayyad doesn't play a role in it. But I thought it was interesting that he himself said, "Listen, it's got to happen."
Yeah.
And people should prepare for it.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people are coming to that conclusion. I mean, to me, it was obvious before the Gaza conflict and before the UN bid, but I think both of those made the need for Palestinian reconciliation much more urgent. And we saw, for example, some movement on the ground immediately after Gaza. There was, we saw Mahmoud Abbas reach out to his old one-time prime minister, Ismail Haniyeh from Hamas, and congratulate him on Gaza's victory, which was an odd sight, I think, for a Western audience. But an important gesture, I think, to show Palestinian unity, especially in times of when you're under attack, there's a natural impulse to close ranks. And we've also seen announcements by Hamas that Fatah prisoners held in Gaza would be released. So we're seeing some movement towards it. I don't know if it will turn into the real deal where we'll get a unified, Palestinian entity. But I see things moving in that direction, and I think it's the right direction. I think all the regional trends necessitate it. I think the need for the goal of a two-state solution requires a coherent Palestinian entity, and it's a basic demand of the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. So for all those reasons, I think it is inevitable and has to come before there is negotiations between the two sides.
All right. Well, I think that's a great moment a great point to end on. Thanks so much, Khaled,
Sure.
for doing this. Look forward to doing it again.